At dawn on November 29, 1864, an American flag was flying over a village of sleeping Cheyenne and Arapaho families in southeastern Colorado, and within an hour, most of the people camped beneath it were dead. That flag was not stolen. It was not a trick. The United States government had given it to Chief Black Kettle with its own hands and told him to raise it because raising it was supposed to keep his people safe. 700 soldiers rode toward that camp anyway, and what happened over the next several hours was so brutal that the government that ordered it spent the next century trying to make sure nobody talked about it. Black Kettle had spent most of 1864 trying to keep his people alive through peace rather than war, which in that time and place was the harder path by far. In September, he rode into Denver with a group of Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders and sat across from Colorado's territorial governor, John Evans, and the man who commanded the territory's volunteer soldiers, Colonel John Chivington. The meeting became known as the Camp Weld Council, and it ended with an understanding that if Black Kettle brought his people to camp near Fort Lyon and placed them under military authority, the Army would protect them. Major Edward Wynkoop, the fort's commander, personally told the chiefs that compliance meant safety, and Black Kettle believed him, which is exactly why he did what he did next. He led roughly 600 people, mostly Southern Cheyenne along with some allied Arapaho, to a bend along Sand Creek, close enough to Fort Lyon that they were, in every practical sense, under the protection of the United States Army. Then Wynkoop was replaced by Major Scott Anthony, a Chivington loyalist who kept reassuring Black Kettle of his safety while secretly requesting reinforcements from Chivington himself. Around the same time, a federal Indian agent had already given Black Kettle a large American flag as a token of goodwill, and Fort Lyon's commander told him plainly to fly it if soldiers ever approached, because they would see it and know the camp was friendly. So when Chivington's forces appeared on the horizon at first light, Black Kettle did precisely what he had been told to do. He ran the flag up a pole above his lodge, tied a white flag beneath it, and called his people to gather underneath it for safety. The soldiers kept coming, roughly 675 to 700 men, a mix of the 1st and 3rd Colorado Cavalry, backed by 4 howitzer cannons, closed in on a camp where most of the able-bodied men were miles away hunting buffalo, leaving mainly women, children, and the elderly, along with a small number of older or younger men who had not gone. Robert Bent, who had been forced to guide the troops there, later testified under oath that he personally saw the American flag waving and heard Black Kettle telling his people to stand around it, and he said the flags were positioned so conspicuously that the soldiers could not possibly have missed them. Chivington gave the order to attack regardless, and cannon fire tore into the village within minutes. Not every soldier obeyed. Captain Silas Soule, along with Lieutenant Joseph Kramer, had already argued that the attack would violate the Army's own promise of safety, and when the shooting started, both men held their companies back and refused to fire into the crowd. But the rest of the force did not hesitate, and the result was a massacre that stretched on for roughly 7 hours, spreading for miles as soldiers hunted down people fleeing up the dry creek bed. Somewhere between 150 and more than 230 people were killed that day, and the overwhelming majority were women, children, and the elderly, since most of the camp's warriors were nowhere near the fighting when it began. Survivors dug frantically into the sandy creek banks trying to escape the gunfire, and soldiers used the howitzers to blast them out of those makeshift shelters. By the time it ended, soldiers were cutting scalps, ears, and other body parts from the dead as souvenirs, and driving off roughly 600 horses before leaving the ruined camp behind them. What happened next tells you as much about the country as the massacre itself did. Chivington's troops rode back into Denver like conquering heroes, and the city gave them exactly the welcome they expected. Soldiers displayed scalps in local saloons and theaters, and some of that grisly material reportedly ended up as props in a celebratory stage production. Newspapers initially reported the attack as a decisive military victory over a dangerous, well-armed enemy, and for a few weeks, that version of events simply stood, unquestioned and unchallenged, because the only people who knew otherwise were the ones being celebrated. That began to unravel because Silas Soule refused to stay quiet. He wrote a detailed letter to Major Wynkoop describing what he had witnessed, including women and children begging for mercy on their knees before being shot and beaten to death by men, in his words, professing to be civilized. His account, along with growing pressure from officers who had also been disturbed by what they had seen, eventually forced the federal government's hand, and 3 separate investigations opened almost simultaneously: a military commission, a joint special committee, and the Congressional Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. All 3 reached the same basic conclusion. Chivington had orchestrated an unprovoked massacre of a peaceful, surrendered camp that had been explicitly promised protection by the United States Army. And yet nothing happened to him. Because Chivington had already resigned his commission by the time the findings came out, the military lost its jurisdiction to court-martial him, and no civilian court in Colorado Territory ever charged him with a crime. He went on to run for political office in Denver and spent years afterward telling audiences his version of the story on public stages, framing Sand Creek as a righteous battle rather than the massacre 3 separate government inquiries had already called it. Soule was not so fortunate. Not long after his testimony helped expose what really happened, he was shot dead on a Denver street in a killing widely attributed to men connected to Chivington, and his murder was never solved. For decades afterward, official military records simply listed Sand Creek as a battle, a quiet linguistic choice that helped bury the truth in plain sight for nearly a century before historians and the descendants of survivors forced a more honest reckoning. Black Kettle survived that morning, carrying his badly wounded wife away from the killing ground and walking east across the freezing plains with whatever remained of his band. He kept pursuing peace for 4 more years, signing another treaty and resettling on reservation land, until he was killed in 1868 in a separate attack led by a different officer, George Armstrong Custer. The flag he raised that morning in November of 1864 did exactly what the United States government told him it would do. It marked his camp as friendly. Soldiers saw it, recognized it, and opened fire underneath it anyway.